Imagine walking into a brand new international airport. The lights are on. The departure screens are waiting. The check-in desks are ready. Outside, there is a runway almost 4 kilometers long. Everything looks like a place that should be filled with thousands of people. Suitcases rolling across the floor. Families waiting at the gates. Planes arriving from different countries. Announcements echoing through the terminal. But there is one problem. Almost nobody is there. And this was not some forgotten little airport built in the middle of nowhere by accident. More than 1 billion euros had been connected to this enormous project. The people behind it believed millions of passengers could eventually pass through every year. They built one of the longest commercial runways in Europe. They planned international routes. They dreamed of high-speed trains connecting passengers directly toward Madrid. Everything was prepared for success. Except for one thing. The passengers never came. This is the strange story of Ciudad Real Central Airport. And the deeper you look into what happened here, the stranger the whole project becomes. Ciudad Real sits south of Madrid in central Spain. It is not one of the country's biggest tourist destinations. It is not Barcelona. It is not Madrid. It is not the Costa del Sol. But during the years when Spain was building enormous infrastructure projects across the country, a very ambitious idea appeared. What if Ciudad Real could become an important international airport? Not just a small regional airport, something much bigger. The airport could serve central Spain. It could have travelers who normally use Madrid. Cargo aircraft could operate there. International airlines could use it. And because a major high-speed railway passed close to the airport, passengers could theoretically travel between the airport and Madrid quickly. On paper, it sounded powerful. A huge airport. A high-speed railway nearby. Plenty of land. Space to expand. And Madrid within reach. The dream became enormous. The airport was designed around the idea that millions of passengers could eventually use it every year. A huge passenger terminal was built. Cargo facilities were prepared. And then came the runway. Almost 4 kilometers of concrete, long enough for some of the largest commercial aircraft in the world. Standing beside it, you would never think this was supposed to be a small airport. Everything about Ciudad Real looked like somebody was expecting something huge to happen. Construction continued. Money poured into the project. And eventually, the airport was ready. But even before the first normal passenger walked through the terminal, something went wrong. The airport was originally expected to open in October of 2008. That opening did not happen. Spanish aviation authorities had not yet approved normal operations because required environmental measures had not been completed. So the grand opening had to wait. After years of planning, construction, and promises, the airport finally began operating in December of 2008. And the timing could hardly have been worse. The global financial crisis was already spreading. Airlines were becoming more cautious. Passengers were cutting spending. And Ciudad Real was about to discover whether the demand everyone had imagined actually existed. During its first month of operation, only a little more than 1,000 passengers used the airport. 1,000 passengers. Inside an airport built with ambitions measured in millions. But maybe that was understandable. The airport had only just opened. Maybe people simply needed time to discover it. Maybe airlines needed time to add routes. Maybe the airport would slowly grow. That was the hope. During 2009, passenger traffic increased. More than 53,000 people used the airport. For a small regional airport, that number might sound respectable. But Ciudad Real was not designed with small expectations. This was an enormous project, and 53,000 passengers across an entire year was nowhere close to what would be needed to justify the dream. Then things became worse. In 2010, passenger numbers fell to around 33,000. The airport was not growing, it was shrinking. And behind those numbers was another problem. Airlines were trying Ciudad Real, but they were not staying. Several carriers operated routes from the airport at different times. There were flights connecting Ciudad Real with places including Barcelona, Mallorca, Paris, London, and the Canary Islands. For a while, there was still hope that one successful route could change everything. Maybe London would work. Maybe Barcelona would create regular business traffic. Maybe tourists would begin using Ciudad Real as an alternative way into central Spain. But one by one, routes disappeared. One airline launched flights between Ciudad Real and London Stansted. Around 22,000 passengers used that service before it was eventually discontinued. Other airlines reduced their operations. Some left completely. And slowly something uncomfortable became obvious. There was a magnificent airport. There was a huge runway. There were check-in desks. There were gates. There were international routes. But there simply were not enough people who wanted to fly from there. The railway connection was supposed to help solve that problem. The high-speed railway between Madrid and southern Spain passed close to the airport. A proper station could have made the airport far more accessible. Passengers could land at Ciudad Real and continue toward Madrid by fast train. It was one of the project's biggest selling points. But the direct high-speed rail station that had been imagined never became a functioning connection for airport passengers. The airport had been built partly around the idea of easy access. But one of the most important pieces of that plan never arrived. And now the terminal was becoming quieter. By the first half of 2011, fewer than 12,000 passengers had used the airport that year. Think about that for a moment. Millions had been imagined. But after more than 2 years of operation, the airport had handled only a little more than 100,000 passengers in total. A project built for huge numbers of travelers had received fewer passengers across several years than some major airports handle in a single busy day. And by then, the financial problems were impossible to ignore. The company behind the airport entered insolvency proceedings. Hundreds of millions of euros in debt were connected to the project. The airport had become one of the most dramatic examples of Spain's construction boom turning into financial disaster. But the strangest part was still coming. By late 2011, almost every scheduled airline had disappeared. Eventually, only a tiny number of scheduled flights remained. At one point, just 2 weekly flights to Barcelona represented almost the entire regular passenger schedule. Imagine arriving at a billion-euro airport and looking at a departure board. Not dozens of flights, not hundreds. 2 scheduled flights in an entire week. Then even those disappeared. In October of 2011, the final scheduled commercial passenger services ended. The terminal that had been built for millions became almost silent. There were no crowds. No packed security lines. No constant flow of aircraft. A enormous runway remained. The terminal remained. The check-in counters remained. But the passengers were gone. Limited private aviation continued for a little longer. Then, in April of 2012, the runway closed completely. Only a few years earlier, this place had opened with huge expectations. Now it was effectively dead. And that should have been the end of the story. But Ciudad Real Airport refused to disappear. After the bankruptcy, the airport was put up for sale. And then came one of the most unbelievable moments in the entire story. A bid of only 10,000 euros was submitted for the airport. 10,000 euros for an airport connected with an investment of more than 1 billion euros. The bid did not become the final sale, but the fact that such an enormous piece of infrastructure would even receive an offer that low showed how badly the project's value had collapsed. Eventually, years later, the airport was sold for just over 56 million euros. Still a huge amount of money, but only a fraction of what had been spent creating the original project. A new owner now controlled the giant terminal, the runway, the hangars, the land, the airport that almost nobody had used. And instead of trying to recreate the original dream exactly as it had been, the new plan changed direction. Maybe Ciudad Real did not need millions of tourists. Maybe its enormous runway could serve another purpose. Aircraft storage, maintenance, cargo, private aviation, training. The airport reopened in 2019 with a completely different identity. And then something unexpected happened. The world entered the coronavirus pandemic. Airlines suddenly had hundreds of aircraft they were not using. Passenger demand collapsed. Planes needed somewhere to go. And Ciudad Real had something airlines desperately needed: space. Huge numbers of aircraft could be parked on the ground there. For a place once famous because planes did not come, the empty airport suddenly became useful because the world had too many planes with nowhere to fly. It was an extraordinary reversal. The airport that failed as a passenger hub found another purpose during one of aviation's darkest moments. But Ciudad Real's strange story still was not finished. After operating again under its new model, the airport later lost normal flight activity following problems involving its flight information service. Once again, the runway became quiet. Once again, questions appeared about its future. And then, in January of 2026, Ciudad Real reopened yet again. On its first day back, 4 international private flights arrived. Together, they carried only around 30 passengers. 30! At an airport that had once dreamed of millions. But perhaps that is the real lesson of Ciudad Real. Because the airport is not really a story about an empty building. It is a story about expectations. Someone looked at an empty piece of land in central Spain and imagined millions of people moving through it every year. They imagined airlines, tourists, cargo, high-speed trains, international connections. They built the infrastructure before the passengers existed. And then reality arrived. There were not enough travelers. The railway connection never became what had been promised. Airlines could not make the routes work. The debts grew. The flights disappeared. And one of Europe's most ambitious private airport projects became famous for its silence. But strangely, Ciudad Real is still there. The terminal still stands. The massive runway still stretches across the landscape. Planes still occasionally arrive. The airport has survived bankruptcy, closure, sale, reopening, another shutdown, and another reopening. Almost 20 years after the original dream began, Ciudad Real Airport is still searching for the road that its builders once believed was obvious. Maybe that is what makes this place so fascinating. It was not destroyed by a war. It was not abandoned because a city disappeared. There was no natural disaster. There was no mysterious accident. They built the airport. They opened the doors. They waited. And almost nobody came.